just introduced you to the fabulous branding studio, and welcome. And I do teach here, as Chiwai just said. So I'm going to get right in here and start introducing you to our great panel. We have a fabulous panel tonight, as you can see. It's probably bigger than some of the other panels you've seen this week at Social Media Week. So as I told all of these guys, and since we started a little late, we had time to do this. It's like a cocktail party. Pretend you all met at a cocktail party, and we're just going to chat. There you go. Pretend. It's branded water. Okay, so it's, you know. Sveta Doucet is a managing partner and head of planning at Profero, New York, where she helps clients like Lufthansa, Smirnoff, and the Pepsi Refresh Project create ideas that people belong to, which is what Profero likes to say that they do. She strongly believes that human understanding is the key to successful communications regardless of the channel, which I don't think any of us could agree with any more than that. So we're going to talk a lot about that later. Nate Landau, next, is a serial entrepreneur. Very serial entrepreneur, my goodness. I looked at his LinkedIn, I was like, how many companies is that? He started or worked at no fewer than 10 different internet companies building consumer-facing sites, including his latest love called foodrepublic.com, which if you haven't been to, go to. It's very cool. I've been checking it out. It's very neat. It's the foodie site for foodies who aren't precious about their foodieism. It's very neat. Mostly men, but that's not women. And started with one of my favorite chefs in New York, Marcus Samuelson, who is adorable. Next, David Rogers is a consultant, speaker, and author of the book, The Network is Your Customer, 5 Strategies to Thrive in a Digital Age. He's executive director of the Columbia Business School Center of Global Brand Leadership, which is not a master's in branding program, I might add. Just saying. And he's the host of the fabulous BRIGHT Conference, Brands Innovation and Technology Conference, held every March at Columbia Business School, which I have to say is one of my favorite conferences to go to if you haven't heard of it. It's pretty cool. They like to say it's the TED of the East. But I tell them. And he posits that customer networks are not just changing the way we build brands, but they're creating whole new business models, which I've heard a lot about. I think we've all heard a lot about this week at Social Media Week, and certainly we're going to talk a lot about that because it's a lot of what all of these guys do. And certainly our next panelist has done that, which we talked yesterday about. Katie Koch really feels that social has to be an integral part of the business model. It's pretty interesting. She's a UX designer and educator who is very passionate about creating communities, disrupting systems, and organizing knowledge. She co-founded Project Interaction, which is a nonprofit design-centered after-school program for high school students, and leads the UX team at a startup called CourseKit, focused on students in higher education. Katie really feels, as I said, that we need to have a systems-level view of social media, so these conversations become integral to all of the brand's business model, which we're going to talk a lot about that. And I think Aaron, our next, yes, you're up. Aaron, our next panelist, shares that view. Aaron runs a web software production shop called Harbinger Group, where, as Aaron says, clients already get social. The clients that come to him already get social. So it'll be interesting to talk about how we can help some of us have our clients get social a little bit better. And they're looking for highly strategic ways to create fan engagement and monetization of that fan base, which is a big deal, because I think we all agree that number of Facebook fans, not really a good metric, kind of a silly metric. So we'll talk a lot about that. And apparently you and I need to play Words with Friends, because you say you're really good at it. I don't know. Our last panelist, that would be a gauntlet.
It gets very ugly.
Okay. Our last panelist is Yvahn Martin, who brings the fashion, as you can tell, brings the fashion to the table. She's Miss Fashionable. She is in charge of multi-channel marketing for DJPremium.com, the high-end division of Dr. J's, which is a pretty legendary brand here in New York. Stores focusing on urban and street fashion. They've been around since, what, 1975?
The stores have. The web is actually a separate company. It's been since '99.
Oh, okay. She is also a Huffington Post blogger, is on the board of a performance activist group, which, with my favorite name for the night, Urban Bushwomen, and hails from my second favorite city in the U.S., New Orleans. So that is our panel for this evening. So we're going to talk, as we said, as you read in the introduction, about branding and social media and the two together. I think we all know, I teach that brands are the sum of everything a company does, right? Brands are really, your brand is not your logo, it's not your advertising, it's everything that the brand does. It's everything that the company does. And it is the impressions that those acts make that create, in your consumer's mind, that create that brand. So that being said, that of course, the logical next step is, well, you have to create communities to do that, right? You have to create a community in order to create all of those impressions. Well, if that's the case, so we have to create communities, why do you guys think it is that social media, some companies have been a little bit slow to embrace social media and are, I call it siloifying it, really looking at it as a separate, nice to do, don't really need to have it. If they're creating communities, wouldn't social be the first thing that they should be doing?
I don't think they all want it.
Mm-hmm.
I think lots of brands have been built without consciously creating.
Mm-hmm.
Created indirectly, but not out of any planning on their own.
So then, but now that social media, and of course community, building a community is not a new idea, certainly not new to the internet. I mean, think Saturn, right? So the Saturn brand.
Yeah, but think Toyota. I mean, Toyota is a very strong brand, but it was a brand that was built very product-driven, engineering-focused organization. So they built a very strong brand really on the strength of their products. And so that's a brand that's very slow to adopt social media in a meaningful way. That's one of the examples of reasons why I think we see brands that were strong brands.
Right.
Before the social led rose, but we're slow moving.
And also, quick to that point, I think that a lot of brands started out with one directional messaging. So they're shouting out on a platform, they're sending out emails or whatever the case might be. But social completely disrupted that by allowing instant user feedback. And I think that has thrown a lot of brands for a loop. When you consider some of the debacles that have happened in the last few years.
We would love to talk about something. So I think that's part of it, right? Is brands see what happened to Dove Chocolate, see what has happened to a lot of brands. And go, oh, I'm not going anywhere near that. But meanwhile, it's happening whether or not they're involved in it.
It seems like what is one of the brands that I work on. A lot of brands forget that what's happened is people have gotten in the way of marketing.
Mm-hmm.
That one-to-one, that very direct message is completely disrupted. That funnel has been disrupted. And I think that's a really jarring thing for a lot of brands. You have to relinquish a lot of control, you have to act a lot faster, you have to think multi-platform, think multi-message, and it can be a bit of a daunting task.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. It's gotten far more complex. So.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the biggest concerns, so in addition to producing apps, we also have like a little social CMS because everybody's got one of those startups nowadays.
Excuse me one second. Can everybody in the back hear?
Barely.
Okay.
Everybody yell.
Let's turn this up to 11. So in addition to just producing custom one-off disposable applications for all these brands and agencies, we also have our kind of little startup social CMS because it's a very popular thing to do. And the big concern for our clients in social, it often is like monitoring, moderating, and curating. And it's always about like the panic that, particularly for some brands, like we can tell, for example, when Greenpeace went after them, and our little spam filter starts sending an email every time a comment hits the board with certain terms in it, and they're getting like hundreds of emails. That's like their nightmare of social right there. And they can't delete them because their internal kind of policy that they've created is like, well, we don't delete comments because that looks, that's even worse, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's the number one thing, the lack of control of this process that you're mentioning. There's also a perception, and I mean, obviously I don't get this because my brands are already, and my clients are already paying lots of money to do this, but the people who don't or who sit on the fence, the perception is that it doesn't ladder up. And the notion that like, a TV ad, right, which for me is like crazy. I mean, it's very effective and obviously staple, but how do you know if that ladders up to a sale or a conversion? There's no measurable impact.
Right.
But the perception is that social is just this flotsam and jetsam. You know, how is it actually going to convert into a noticeable uptick?
Right. Well, the metrics have to be very different, right? The metrics for a television ad are very, very different than the metrics even for a print ad, or and certainly for social. So, like we said before, we were joking about number of Facebook fans. I mean, I've heard it in my consulting. We want to get 40 exposures to Facebook fans. And what are you going to do with those Facebook fans once you get them?
Right.
So that, you know, it's that education about that metric. How do you think that or those metrics, how do you think we can?
Well, with that idea of fan acquisition and that being a focus.
Right.
I think it works for some brands. For one of the brands I work on, Smirnoff, it made a lot of sense that they went out and said, we want to amass the biggest spirits community in the world. Why? Because they can learn a hell of a lot.
Right.
They can impact it, and getting as many young people in means that they're almost going to future-proof their brand. Now, what happened is we did it a lot faster than we thought we were going to do. So now we're in this holy shit kind of moment where we have all of these people posting pictures of drunk nights out, and that doesn't work. And that's when that control, that's when they get a little scared. So we've shifted the conversation now to think, well, how do we drive conversion? And how do we get people to actually go and do stuff in real life? Because that's actually the power of social, is getting people to actually go and do stuff in real life and actually to behave in the way the brand wants you to behave.
So how were you able to, you got this client
That's
who,
meetings next week.
you know, but it's, you know, this client who, as you guys were talking before about the, you know, the horror show of, oh God, we've got these, you know, terrible things happening. Now all of a sudden Smirnoff makes perfect sense. Yes, that they should build a community. Two things. Number one, what are they doing with that community once they amass it? I think that's the key. And then also once they lose that control and people start posting drunk pictures, how do you as their thought leadership provider help steer that conversation with them to, hey, it's still a good thing, but now we need to do this.
Well, I think what we've done is realize that people have a really good time and are really open about sharing that with Smirnoff. And so what we've had to do is reframe the role of social media for that brand to being less of a broadcast channel about, oh, it's Friday night, go get your cocktail and whatnot, and making it more of a participatory enabler, a nightlife enabler brand. So we've had to reframe the social media mission, let's say. And actually, it's not relinquishing control, it's just letting the people on the platform lead a little bit more. And what we're doing, I think what we're trying to do is actually plan not just for the people that we reach, but for the people that they reach. And so it's a little bit more of network planning than, let's say, a social media strategy.
Okay. And how but it's not really changing the inherent. You're changing what you're using social media for, but it's not that you're using it to change the brand in any way or the brand perception in any way.
No, it's about, well, Smirnoff is about original nightlife experiences. It's about it's the most mixable vodka. It's a well drink. It's really accessible. So the spirit and that behavior of that brand in the social space should feel democratic in the same way that the brand feels like a social equalizer. But the way in which we navigate the conversation and sort of shift the audience around within the communities. I'm not talking about Facebook alone.
Right.
Instagram, Twitter, all their different platforms. This is across the world as well. That's shifting. Just like when you go to a party, you don't have the same conversation over and over. You need to keep it interesting. So that's next week.
I was just, so what's interesting is when you get to some of the high-end beauty and fashion brands though, like DVF or we've done a lot of stuff for Estee Lauder, which actually Estee Lauder's not a great example. Like DVF and or any of the kind of high-end fashion brands. Like what's interesting is their print and their out of home and their standard kind of creative is all about how inaccessible and how aspirational, right? It's all about like these super skinny, tall people who will never be, but oh my God, I want to be that person, so I'm going to buy this thing. And but then you come to Facebook, which is a totally different platform. It's the opposite, and now it's the real conundrum is like, well, how does that brand now become conversational and kind of, hey, oh, you want to talk to me? Oh, okay. I'm
That's why
the crazy model from the poster, but sure, let's talk. it's a transition, so that's kind of an interesting thing to see.
That's why the luxury brands have been so slow.
Yeah.
That's another reason why brands were very strong brands. Were in that category. The entire category was incredibly hesitant. I mean, they were hesitant to even put up websites. I remember the early websites and like
because it was considered too democratic.
It just couldn't look as good. I mean, think about early browsers, early web design. It was never going to look as good as the most gorgeous, brochure or store experience. So they were very slow. And then social media was like, oh my gosh, this is takes away the prestige, takes away the exclusivity.
Right.
So that's another comment.
Well, interestingly, you mentioned Estee Lauder, which you said was not a good example, but I mean, Estee Lauder, we talk about the brand, to me, it's an old brand, it's an older brand.
They're huge on social though.
So explain that, because you're not talking about 24-year-olds, I don't think.
Well, keep in mind, EL, the parent company, owns for
so you're not talking about Estee Lauder brand.
Origins. No, but Estee Lauder proper does a lot of social and digital. And the mandate right now for that company is just overwhelmingly shifting towards social. The thing about those types of product-driven beauty brands is that they have it really easy, because if they want to gain a fan, they just give away a sample, and if they want to gain 1 million fans, they just give away 1 million samples.
Which Estee Lauder created
the craze for that, and so they crush our servers, and the fans want more, but they're actually very innovative. I mean, they do a ton of kind of across the board. It's not just as basic as sampling applications, but they do have it easy in the sense that when they want to gain fans, it's like 2 days later they have 300,000 more fans.
It's an easy, they have a very easy way to turn on fans.
But for them, that's where they're going.
Is just social or very. And do they utilize it differently for their different brands? So an Origins or an Aveda is going to have a very different consumer and has a very different brand, certainly, than Estee Lauder or Clinique.
I haven't seen that. I mean, obviously the communications are different. The problem is with Facebook, this is going to be a Facebook-centric conversation, I feel like, but with Facebook, so Facebook-centric. With Facebook, there's only so many tools that work, and so. Yeah, you can be one of the first brands to try some crazy new app, and 5 different brands that try it later, it will actually work. Or you can do a UGC contest, a sampling application. There's only 10 different types of engagements with users that have been proven to work.
Right.
Mixing and matching and interweaving different communications and things like that. And so I think a lot of times people will just reach to that bucket, oh, what do we know works?
Right. Well, that's the same with anything. Right? What do we know works? But okay, so that it's not a Facebook-centric conversation.
Right.
Katie, you've talked a lot. You and I talked a lot about the fact that you really feel that. Most of what you've worked on is that social needs to be an integral part of the business model. And I've taught my students, you can't brand a company. You can't talk about the brand if you don't understand the business model. Right? You can't do that. So talk about how you feel social is really an integral part of the business model, and how you think that experience, what best practices would you bring to a more established brand, perhaps, that is slow to tip its toe in the water?
Sure. I think Sveta hit on it earlier, that it's no longer a one-way communication. It's a conversation that we're having now with our consumers or our users. In my field, we call them users. And that opens up a lot of possibility when suddenly you have to talk back.
Speak up a little, because I don't think they can hear you.
Okay, so it changes the entire dynamic that you have when you have to talk back. And you're forced to decide what that voice is. It's no longer just a static document that lives somewhere in a file on your computer that says who you are as a brand. It's something that you have to manifest every time you tweet, or every time you post something to Facebook. So it can't just be a tacked-on consideration. It has to be something that you're considering every time you open up the browser to tweet, or every time you open up Facebook to share something. It has to be extremely tied to that statement and that belief that you have about yourself as a brand or as a company. And it just kind of trickles down through everything that you do.
So then in that case, we were talking about this before too, who owns social media in the company, in the corporate structure? Is it marketing? Is it IT? Is it customer service?
It's most often marketing, but I mean,
Yeah.
the organizations that are most advanced, what I write about is a networked organization or a network-oriented organization, do not put it in a single department.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the progression of Dell, for example, because they started out the process very early on because they got, they got burned, and they eventually, so they built a center of sort of excellence. But even from the beginning, it was supposed to be looking at social media and customer relationships and how they connected to all their business, disciplines, marketing, product innovation, customer service. Then they eventually decided, even that, they split it out. So each business unit, they organized around, I think, 4 major business units. Public sector, large enterprise, medium enterprise. Each one has its own, division, its own center of excellence, and they have sort of a small team that's really just sort of pulling best practices from around the organization and sharing.
Right.
And that's really the model, I think, which organizations are moving towards, is that their digital strategy is not sitting, marketing is most often where it starts.
Right.
It's not sitting just in any one discipline, because that's not going to tap all the capacity for the business of the community.
Sveta, are you seeing that with your clients? Is that that new model, or?
We're seeing our clients, we're seeing it start from the marketing team, and then when they ask us to come in and put in place digital strategies, and then we turn around and say, can we meet your customer service people, or your crisis management, or your PR?
You guys are saying to your
We're saying
clients,
this,
okay.
and what we're saying is, if you actually, and HR, if you actually want to game change through social media, you need to actually change your organization structurally. There's no agency that
And you're telling your clients
we
that.
have to, and quite frankly, it's probably going to put me out of work, because what we're saying to them is,
I wouldn't be worried.
I can't do this job. No, it's funny. I met with the CMO of McDonald's, and she's got a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
She's got to sell burgers, but keep
And she's got a
huge
huge
risk.
downside risk in social.
And what she's done is she's restructured her entire team and her entire group, and I think she's still going through that process. But the clients that we work really well with actually do a mini social task force per se, and they really try. And then of course someone will pull me inside and say, I need to go home at 6. This is like 2 jobs. So it's almost like we try and create the need and then the demand for it, and then they start to hire more people. But it's becoming a bigger force with it.
Yeah, one of the more interesting models that I've seen tried, I don't know how it's working for them very well yet, but Best Buy has allowed any of their employees to register, and as long as they have like a valid employee number or something of that nature, they get access to Best Buy's Twitter account.
Oh, dear God.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Holy crap. Not
Mass
only have you lost
social
control,
customer service.
not only have you lost
That's
control of
exactly
your
right.
customers, you lost control with a bunch of, 18-year-olds in Oceanside, New York.
Potentially. I mean, they have some type of mechanism, I would imagine, to keep track of who's
Holy
posting
crap.
what, but
Well, I mean, and that is, to your point, Sveta, that's a whole other, now you're telling your client, well, okay, you need to do all of this, and now you need to hire 37 people
But
to
they
run
had
it.
built a whole, it had started as a whole social network. It was a Blue Shirt Nation, which had just sort of grown up organically within the company. So the culture was there before an agency had just come in and said, you know what, you should have all your employees do service on Twitter. It would have been like, are you insane?
I think this idea though is happening at smaller companies too,
Oh,
not just
yeah.
at big brands. I mean, I work for a 7-person startup. I embody the brand as much as everyone at my company, and whatever I tweet, it reflects my own personal brand, but at the end of the day, it also reflects my company. So even though I'm not wearing a blue shirt and joining my army, I work in a small company, and so I am manifesting that social media brand as well. And I think that's true of every small company that's out there. I'm sure that Nate would have some thoughts on that as a serial entrepreneur. We already have this distributed model, and it's just kind of working its way up the food chain into the bigger brands. And I think within a few years, that idea where I work at this company, I own this brand too, and everything that I say reflects that too.
I think that's like very democratic, but I don't think that applies to brands that, for example, like you work at Mattel or you work at Barbie, you're not going to go on and talk for Barbie. Barbie is a character,
Right.
and I don't know how many of you guys follow her on Facebook.
Come on, tell the truth.
But Barbie, Barbie is a character. Right now, she's running around with her dream wardrobe, making little girls.
Now, I just heard this and some other thing from social media. How many Twitter followers does Barbie have? Some insane number.
I don't even. She crushes our servers.
Everybody's crushing your servers. You need bigger servers.
It's every night I get these little texts. I mean, it's ridiculous. I get these text alerts. Server is down. It's like, oh my god. Just one
Barbie's
night.
had it again.
Barbie, why? But you know, like
Just looking at John T. Can't even tell me this.
this is like, you know, first it was like brands needed a voice, and so then they would hire a social web agency, they'd hire a PR firm, they'd hire some huckster, guru, and they would create a document or something like that, and they created their brand voice. Okay, that's who we are online, you know, it's like Kenneth Cole. You know what a Kenneth Cole ad looks like, and what it sounds like, and you get the humor, and it doesn't touch me, but it touches people, I guess. You know, now that's not enough. Now it's a narrative, and it's not like, who is Barbie on Facebook, but like, what did she do last week? And what did Barbie do? Can you guys tell me what Barbie did for Valentine's Day last year? She took Ken back. That's love.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Aww.
That's love. And that collective awe was said by like 5 million girls across the world. So that's like the notion that employees could run that, I think works for a kind of startup level or a company that identifies itself with its workers, or for a company that has a real solid brand identity and character and voice and narrative. That's something that's like...
Well, it's that lack of control.
Yeah.
I mean, I have done a lot of work with financial services companies, and one of the biggest issues that they have is they legally have to maintain control. And so you have to be very careful about your financial consultants or your bankers tweeting and Facebooking. As a matter of fact, most brokerage firms just very recently allowed their brokers to even have yeah, to even have a
Because it
Facebook.
grew that day. And then
It's true. Facebook or Twitter, and you know, all tweets need to be compliance approved. Well, by the time the damn thing is compliance approved, it's 3 days old. So there, that was helpful. You know, that whole pace of change. Now, financial services being the absolute this end of things. There are a lot of other companies that are very similar.
I'll take it.
They're throwing phones at you. You know, they're on the extreme end of it, but that whole idea of, you know, our lawyer has to read every tweet, and how do you help as, you know, both within organizations, probably not a big deal except for Katie's in your case name. It's a tiny little company, but in bigger companies, when you're talking to your larger clients, how do you get them over that and help them through that? It's a tough one. It's a very tough one.
I can speak to the experience with Dr. J's. We actually had 2 huge fan-created groups prior to Dr. J's ever even looking at Facebook. So our process was reclaiming our digital identity from the consumers and sort of trying to figure out how we were going to wrangle that. There's still 2 groups on Facebook.
Were you like the real Dr. J's on Twitter?
Well, actually, Dr. J's, we're Dr. J's _com on Twitter because some coder somewhere not in America already owned the Dr. J's Twitter handle was an early adopter, and we didn't get a chance to reclaim that, and he was unresponsive to, well, never mind. You know, and so Dr. J's fans, I don't know if you guys know the stores. We're actually a separate entity. The online is separate from the brick and mortar. We don't really have any sort of shared resources. But the fans of Dr. J's are really passionate. They have been buying sneakers and jeans from Dr. J's for decades now. You know, whether they're now buying for their kids or whatever the case might be. And so people have a lot to say. And we find ourselves kind of being driven by the conversation. And it's not always... You know, we're a multi-brand retailer, so that is our identity. It's all of the brands that we carry, it's our product mix, it's the way that we interact around those things. So very unlikely things, like we don't have like a set you know, sort of brand identity on social media, because we have everything from Beyonce's brand, which has a very, you know, House of Darion has a very specific consumer, versus Nike has a very specific consumer, versus LRG or some of the type of brands. And so, I mean, some of our most popular tweets will be like, what are you wearing today? Or go Knicks, and just explodes with activity. And then when you're trying to force feed people marketing messages, it doesn't work. So I think that every company sort of arrives at its social space based on its community that already exists, and then sort of works backwards from there to see how their social strategy can best utilize that community to get the message out.
So Dave, how would someone like Toyota, you mentioned before, that had a very, very strong fan base before it actually had fans?
Yeah.
How does that, what Yvahn just said, sort of how would Toyota or a company like it activate that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to take the steps that we've been talking about. You need to clearly understand what your brand's going to stand for. If your brand has been somewhat functional, sort of product-driven, product-oriented, you're going to have to sort of go back and do a little work on it, try to understand, okay, how do we define our brand in a way that's a bit more human, that's maybe more aspirational, has more of an emotional dimension to it.
Right.
So I wouldn't say, don't jump in too fast and say, let's just start throwing stuff out. I also tend to, when I'm talking to brands that are kind of getting started a little late to the game, try to stress
Established brands that are...
Yeah, stress kind of what Aaron was talking about, this editorial role. Talking about what's the narrative, what's Barbie doing this week. You've got to start thinking like a media company. You need to start creating stories and creating content, not advertising, but content that people are going to follow and come to and share just as content. And that's going to have to be the core of your social media. Because if you're just on Instagram and Twitter and Google Plus and Foursquare and all these places, and you don't have that content and that story in place, then a lot of product samples and a lot of links and announcements and promotions are going to kind of wear thin in the stream after a while.
Starts to feel hollow.
Yeah.
Well, you also get brands that just read like a Sears catalog, and you can imagine like a monotone voice. Check out our new release.
Toyota, literally, its first step, they were too nervous to start a blog. So they started a YouTube channel, and they just took their TV ads and put them on the YouTube channel. Of course.
It's gonna go viral.
It's like another broadcasting spot.
It's a lot cheaper than the Super Bowl, hey?
Yes.
Think of it that way. But yeah, that's the other thing, is I think that these brands, and I want to get to this in a second, usually run by people over the age of, and big brands we're talking about, usually run by people over the age of 35. Don't, they just think magically it's going to go viral. That doesn't happen. We know that doesn't happen.
Luckily, that term is kind of no longer in the past.
Yeah.
That's phased
That's
out.
a bad word.
I think when teenagers say it, they're referring to something else. Just saying.
I think what we, with that word viral, what we've always said a lot to, or what we've said a lot to our clients is like, putting a piece of content or creating it and saying it's going to go viral is like telling a pregnant woman to have a beautiful child. Like, you give her all the vitamins, you can brush her hair, put blah, blah, blah. You don't know what you're going to get when it comes out. Right. So it's almost like feeding that process. So you can't really rely on content in that way.
So how do you talk to someone who didn't grow up? I mean, let's face it, was over the age of 30 or 35 and didn't necessarily grow up in this space and is now realizing, okay, I'm a CMO of whatever company, big company. And I know that social's big and I have to get into it. I am by my nature going to siloify it because that's what I did with direct mail, what I did with direct response, the same kind of thing. How do you go, and then I'm going to put metrics on it, like how many fans do I have? How do you go about explaining to that CMO or that site owner, let's reframe the conversation. We're building a brand here. This is part of building the brand, and here's how this piece is going to fit. How do you do that?
Well, a big part of it is we remind them that what they want to do is connect with people. And we remember that it's not about consumers, or actually we call them users more than anything else, is we want to connect with people.
You do?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, they're users because the same person that lives in the offline world isn't actually the same person who lives in the digital world. They actually use the space differently to do
The same person.
The same person. Right, so if you're tweeting right now, you're using your platform very differently than you are talking to somebody in a grocery store. So we remind a lot of the CMOs, and quite frankly, by the time we're brought in, they realize that they have to do something, and it's almost like triage when we go in. And so it's, you want to connect with people naturally talk. It is about creating advocacy that connect. It's not just loyalty, it's not just about driving sales, it's about ultimately a more effective way for your media dollars to be spent to an extent. I still believe TV works. And we start with
Especially with a hashtag.
With a hashtag, yeah, or a drive to Facebook there as well. But we start with what's your brand about, what's your identity about, and what's your business about. So we went in and talked to Graco, they make what do you call it, strollers and things, and we identified a social mission for them about letting moms and dads out there know that the people behind the brand are parents too. And that's a really powerful thing for a mom to feel online. That the person I'm buying a stroller from knows exactly what I'm going through. And by the way, they're mostly guys who work there, they're not moms. So we actually go, but they're dads,
yeah.
but they are dads. And we go through this sort of more of a, I guess, an empathetic lens to building a brand in the digital space. But oftentimes it comes back to, maybe you actually haven't articulated your brand very well. And actually maybe people don't really care about the way in which you've done it. So we kind of use social maybe as a test bed for where we can go in the
And what the
space.
brand stands for in the eyes of
Yes.
users, consumers, whatever we want to call them.
There's a lot of brands that just shouldn't do social.
I agree.
Oh,
There's just a lot of brands. I get calls, not every week, but I get calls often where I'm just like, look, I mean, we're slammed. I could charge you, we could do this, but honestly, let's just run through the numbers. The one company, small business, wanted to do this Facebook thing and set up the page and do the apps and the whole kind of like, deluxe car wash. And
because they knew they needed to get one of those.
they got to do it, they got to do it. And they're in the pet food vertical. And I was just like, look, I'll send you the menu and you can see the prices. And they're like, okay, that's really a lot of money, but we know we got to do it, And I'm like, okay, what do you want to get out of this? And they gave me this number of like people that they want to get into the stores. And I was just like, okay, let's just work back from this. Let's go to all the cities. How many people in these cities? So we just like sat down in front of Facebook targeted advertising and was like, look, in these cities, on Facebook, within your niche interest, there's only 1/10 the number of people that you think you're going to get to go into your store. And they did not want to hear that, yada, yada, yada. And I honestly said, look, do radio advertising. It's going to be so much more effective for you. Local radio, boom, every time. Little jingle at the end. People love that stuff. And that's an example. Another example is just like certain products should not be social. I mentioned to you on the phone, Jock Itch Cream should not be social.
This is actually a very funny thing. You guys didn't hear about this.
There was an RFP for,
It's hilarious.
I actually think it's foot fungus.
Yeah, whatever.
It might have been Jock
What's
Itch.
fungus between friends?
I kid you not, it was a user-generated content contest. RFP. Like, show, yeah, show us your fungus. I kid you not,
That would be bad.
But to that, on that point, I did work with a client who it was for a scalp issue. They really wanted to be in the social space, and and they wanted to sell products through. They wanted to use a social platform as an e-commerce model, and we didn't necessarily know if that was the right thing. But it was basically a scalp issue that people have a really difficult time dealing with. And it's actually a huge embarrassment. It wasn't dandruff, I forget what it was. It was like psoriasis of the head or something.
Okay.
And so it wasn't about socializing and making it a very open community. It was about socializing and making it a more empathetic, sharing sort of community. So no, you didn't see photo uploads of people's problems. You saw them of their success stories. And it became actually a really powerful place for them. Now they wanted to push that content out and get the people featured in their ads, and that's where they're getting some pushback. But again, I think it's really about articulating what's the role of the brand in the social space. How do you want to socialize?
And that role is probably going to be very different than it is in the offline space and even in the rest of the digital space.
I would think so.
I think it's also about objectives. I mean, that was what Aaron talked about starting this conversation, saying, okay, where do you actually want to get this for this, you know, the pet food brand? I mean, I think the problem, you know, you say, why are the metrics so poor? Why are we so tactically focused? It's because it's been easier and more fun to just talk about tools. Hey, there's a new thing, let's get on it, than to talk about objectives, because when you start talking about objectives, you have accountability. And marketers don't like to
And
be
we actually have to
accountable.
sit down and think about it.
Yeah, we have to know if what we did mattered to the business at the end of the day. And so, you know, you know, who wants to bring that up? So we let that come up a little later in the conversation. But that's, you know, that's what happens. So I mean, I think when you start with it, then you're, yeah, do we want a gazillion fans on a given platform? And obviously for some brands like Smirnoff, yes, because you have a certain objective. We want to own a certain share of mind within our category. That's our whole business plan. You know, business objective are tied around that. So now we have a reason for this. But if the objective mismatches with the platform and it's about driving people into the store at a scale that's not going to be achievable, then you take a different tool. Radio's perfect.
Right, okay. And now Yvonne, in the Dr. J's example, there really isn't store traffic because it's two separate things. It's a totally online e-com kind of platform. So then you can, but you're using the, excuse the language, I apologize, I don't mean it to be pejorative, but you're using the borrowed interest of the Dr. J's brand.
Yes, there was a lot of brand recognition there, but we have a content site and we have the e-commerce site, and so we're sort of trying to build our own digital presence, you know, not just in the stores. And actually, one of the biggest comments that we noticed before we started taking more ownership of the social media pages was, when are you opening a store in my area? When are you, you know, and to a prior point that we had, like, people were asking us actively customer service questions on Twitter and Facebook. Why is my shipment late? You know, we had to get customer service involved where it was only in the domain of marketing at first. So it was sort of by necessity.
Yeah, so it's why when you said, and I didn't realize, when you said that they were separate, I kind of like, because how would you do that? Because that would be the first place I would go, is my shipment was late, or your pants didn't fit, or pictures of the pants.
Sizing, or, you know, how do, you know,
They
does
are
this
by
come in
nature.
different colors? That's what people interact with us about, you know, aside from those shoes are hot, you know,
Right.
but it's all of that.
That's like the default though. If you don't do anything with your social channels, you're just gonna get, my shoelaces broke, send me a new one, or you know, when are you gonna release this for the Android? Like, guaranteed across every vertical.
Right, okay.
If you're not actively steering that narrative and conversation and
Talking about
Becomes customer service.
instantly, without fail.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then,
Because it does make sense.
Right,
Yeah.
because it's immediate.
Yeah.
So now, being as a serial entrepreneur, small startups, you really haven't had to deal with any of this sort of convincing people stuff.
Well,
Look how lucky you are.
Well, I actually do, because a big piece of our business is selling partnerships with larger brands and selling our expertise in social media and content creation in particular,
Right.
as a way for them to help them activate online. So what Food Republic is we're a publishing company that's really focused on kind of the convergence of food and spirits and men, which is a growing place. There used to be a big stigma around guys in the kitchen. Now it's, you know, a big part of our culture. And there's a lot of larger brands that come to us because we're speaking to their market. You know, the guys that we're talking to are drinking spirits, they're mixing good drinks, they're interested in what they're wearing, you know, they're interested in traveling all over the world. So, for example, we partnered with Lufthansa in December.
Let's talk.
We should
We
have,
will.
became an issue.
Yeah. We sent one of our writers to Germany to cover the Christmas markets over there. And they tweeted and blogged from the Lufthansa domains. So they gave our blogger their Twitter handle. They created a big site that all the content was pushed through. So we actually spent a lot of time educating Lufthansa on, you know, how this could actually work to engage their users, or I should say customers, because, you know, ultimately they want to drive people to travel the
This is an
journey.
interesting sort of semantic to me. I would never call a customer a user.
No, I
But
can't
that's-
help it. It's just been my
You're
DNA.
a customer, but when they're in the platform and you're giving them something to do, you're giving them something to use, and you're giving it doesn't have to, I hate the term branded utility, but you're giving them a purpose.
Mhm.
And that's why I like that word user. Because user, I don't know if you would agree, like it signifies a behavior, like an action. Like what do you want someone to do versus a customer, which is I feel like very passive, like I will buy it.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
I do say customer too.
But where I see there's a great opportunity for brands large and small is really being seen as an expert in something, where your users, your consumers on the social streams and everywhere else will be turning to you for information, whether it's about your brand specifically or about something ancillary to
You're
it.
adding value to their lives in some other way than shilling.
That's exactly right. So I mean, you can have 4 million Facebook fans, but if all you're doing is telling them when your products are going on sale, you're not really engaging in a dialogue and creating any type of real brand resonance with those people. Whereas if you become seen as the place where they can ask a question or learn something that they didn't know, or find out about your supply chain or whatever it might be, learn about, in Lufthansa's case, why the Christmas markets in Germany are a great place to go on vacation. And get into the history of it and everything. Now you're providing real value to them in a way where you're almost becoming a publisher. And that's a very powerful thing for a lot of brands.
Go ahead, Katie.
I think that hits on the idea of it becoming a relationship too. Those people are giving you a like on Facebook, and that's not really a big effort for them, but they do expect something in return, and it can't just be pushing when your products are coming out. It has to be something that they can't get elsewhere, whether it's a piece of knowledge that you specifically curated just for your Facebook users, or if it's something brand new that they're never going to see anywhere else. That's still giving something back. And when you have 40,000 Facebook fans, they're like little baby birds. They want something, or else they're going to
Oh, I love that.
So I mean, I think we've talked a lot about generating those users, but then what?
Yeah.
Then what is they leave?
Well, actually, that thing is not our brands realize is you may not realize they're leaving.
Right.
Because most people do not unfollow
That's
you
right.
if they're bored
Yeah.
of you on Facebook.
They just don't look at you anymore.
But
They
they
just
don't-
mute. They mute.
Hi.
They hide it.
They mute it, or simply by ignoring you after a certain number of times,
Right.
EdgeRank, which is Facebook's algorithm, which
Right.
is set up to weed you out
Right.
and leave the friends in, unless you pay Facebook to be a sponsored story, they'll just start weeding you out. So you didn't even realize, you're like, wow, we've still got 2 million fans, but gosh, our numbers, our likes and responses when we post these, sales and new product launches, getting lower and lower.
Yeah, you
They
can see
didn't
it too. You
unfriend
can
us.
see the engagement it just
Right.
drops off so sharply, especially after they do these huge pushes to gain acquire fans, but then they don't follow up with the engagement of those fans, or a lot of brands too. The big obviously the catchphrase now is not viral, it's conversation, but it's like.
They don't want to have
You're
a
so
conversation.
you're so boring to talk to, Brand X. I would love to, but I'd rather talk to the wall.
Yeah, it should be an effortless conversation.
It should be
They shouldn't be
engaging.
standing there trying to think of something to say
I
to you.
know.
You should just make it easy for them to talk back.
It's like the dork at the bar, and they just blurt something out to you. You're like, okay. My friends are waiting for me outside. But no, when you have them, right? Like you're talking about how you can educate. I would say education, entertaining is like one bucket.
Right.
There's and then there's like incentive, like.
What you were talking about,
What do you give them?
sampling.
Exactly. What are you doing for me? And incentive, I think, breaks down into like actual hard incentive, like am I going to win a trip to Vegas? But it also breaks down into an incentive, like am I going to get some cachet with my friends for having interacted with this brand and being in the know and being the first to see this content, etc. So it's a little nuanced on that end of the spectrum. But incentives, nothing happens without incentive.
And
In terms
content.
of moving people.
And the content, I think, really, we all know content is king. But it just seems like just aggregating content is not going to get it. That's going to actually damage your brand as opposed to.
But content can be an incentive. So exclusive content can be an incentive. And content is, I think, such a, we say content, but content's actually really easy, but also really, really difficult. And so I think it's, to your point, that perception that there's that value exchange and that you're getting something that you couldn't get elsewhere. And that's not the easiest thing to do.
I mean, one of the things that we do is we give our Twitter handle and access to our Facebook page to kind of, I call them B-level celebrities, although if Mrs. Tatum is going online. but you know, these are they're chefs that are big in one market, or you know, DJs that are very big in you know a certain subculture or something, and we give them access to our
So
to
they're
do
not
whatever
big,
they
they're
want.
just regional.
Right, exactly. You know, and we give them access to our social streams from Instagram to Twitter, and we you know give. You know, the sky's the limit. They can do whatever they want with it for that day, and then we drum up a lot of interest around it. And it's a way to always keep the conversation new and fresh, because it's always bringing in new voices, so it's not just the same people writing about the same thing all the time.
And you're really building the brand,
Yep.
and again, I don't mean this to be pejorative, but you're building the brand on the backs of
That's
those
exactly
chefs.
right. Yep.
But you're giving them a voice so they don't
Mhm.
care. So it
Right.
really is a good
Yep.
symbiotic
Yep.
relationship.
We've been talking a lot about Facebook, and I'm just going back to the question you asked, like how do we talk to CMOs about how do you even start to have things like conversations and participation and all
It's
this
a whole new
collaboration, all these
Yeah.
words that I write every deck and I really don't know what they mean, but is if you look at a brand's sort of digital footprints, and it's really simplified, but it's the way I like to think about it, we look at platforms like a Twitter as the mouthpiece of the brand, right? It's quick, it's fast, that's the talking, just as we're having a conversation here. We look at a platform like Facebook as being the heart of the brand, like a community where you can actually foster that sort of engagement. We look at, if they have a .com, as the spine of it, something that actually links all those platforms together. Something like Instagram or something like YouTube are the sort of the eyes of it. That's the visual stimulus of the brand, which is why we say don't put your
Well, that's really
TV spot up there. So that's kind of a way that we sort of, I guess, simplify it in a way for a CMO to kind of understand that
it's each has different
Roles.
purposes and roles. That's really interesting. That's really. Katie, how do you feel about that? I mean, you're again in a business model that's completely socially based, but I think that's really interesting what Sveta just said of, Instagram has this specific purpose, and it doesn't have the purpose of Facebook. It has this other purpose, and Facebook has this purpose that Twitter doesn't have. How do you view that when it's so integral to the business model?
Well, I think purpose, kind of from a different angle, I mean, purpose is a really important reason why social media can be hard from the user standpoint too. When you have Instagram or Flickr or some other photo sharing app, what's my incentive to share anything with you? Because I don't really know where to put it if you've given me all of these options. So I think it's the responsibility of the brand too to clearly shape what they want me to share and when and where and what. Because if you don't put those constraints on your users, they're going to be sharing nothing.
You have to tell them what you want them to do. Basically.
Exactly. You have, I think to her point, you have to have a very clear understanding of what those different pieces mean for you. Is YouTube the channel that you're choosing? Do you need a presence on Vimeo then too? Do you? I don't know. Are the same users going to be watching videos on both sites? So understanding that purpose of each channel and of each medium, I think is totally 100% spot on. If you want users to participate at all.
Right. So do you feel, as a group, that, we talked about brands worrying about that lack of control, that loss of control, and they're used to having control of their message, but they still need to curate the conversation. They need to not be the boring guy at the bar who doesn't know what to say. Is that how brands can, not control is the wrong word, but how they can curate that conversation is by telling you what they want you to do and how they want you to do it. Or where's the line of that's too much, the brand is overstepping their bounds.
I don't think there's very clever and I'm constantly amazed because I do not engage with brands on Facebook. We were saying we're not on Facebook because it's our job to be on Facebook.
Right.
Because the last thing you want to do is like go home and let's see what's in the old news feed. But I'm always amazed at when it works. I'm always I'll see the creative. I'll be like, it's very clever. I don't think a lot of people are going to engage with it. I keep my mouth shut, whatever, we'll do it. And then I'm just astounded at how people love to interact with these brands. And did you guys do Fridge Tender or was that someone else?
that was nice.
Oh, so Smirnoff did, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fridge Tender. It's
Great.
It's like a bartender in your fridge.
Sveta does not want to tell you to do it. I can see
But what was clever about Fridge Tender was, they created this character around this ultimately very derivative and silly product. How hard is it to mix a cranberry and vodka, people? Are you
so many you've had?
No, after the 10th one, I want people to mix it. But why not just buy it at a store? So great. So they mix these very simple drinks, And but then they created this dude who lives in your fridge, and he's the dude that's making you these drinks. And then they took it a step further, and they like let people download these masks of this dude's face. Which again, I was just like, there's no way this is. I mean, who would? And then you're just like, oh my god, they're doing it. One after another, people are having fridge tender parties where everybody's wearing the mask of the fridge tender and drinking fridge tender, and it's just like, what? No, stop! Why would you do this? And they love it. They love it. It's like a thing now. It's like icing. Why would that become a thing? It's a thing.
It is a thing, yes, it's very
It's the
true.
beautiful baby.
Bros icing bros.
Well, the funny thing is the brief that we actually have on the table that I have to go sort out is around ice, around Smirnoff Ice. And they're like, well, we have this product and no one buys it, and we don't, and we need to know how to like push sales of this. And I'm like, there's this cultural phenomenon around icing. People love it. So how do you tap into that passion point and bring the brand closer, but then not dilute the enthusiasm of the people around it?
And also keep the momentum going after icing becomes
Or figure out what's the next like sort of cultural wave around it. And maybe
Icing's not going anywhere.
Sound
It's
like
just getting more elaborate. I've seen some crazy ices.
there have been some crazy ones. That's
Yeah.
very true. Dave, you want to?
No?
Okay, that's fine.
Just thinking when I'm gonna drink tonight.
Fridge tender, and we have a mask for you.
Oh wow.
But that's, you know, how much involvement, what we were talking about before, of, you know, where does the brand step in, where does the brand step out? I mean, how do you gauge that? How do you gauge that level of interaction, right? Just like you were talking before about the conversation at the bar, right? That we all know the socially awkward person who kind of doesn't know when to speak, doesn't know when not to speak, and then talks at the wrong time, and you almost feel bad for them. Brands that don't do it right, you watch it. I mean, it's like it's watching a train wreck. You're going, oh, that's bad. They don't see that. I mean, how do you help a brand to not do that?
To take away admin access to their
Okay,
All right.
Turn you off.
We'll hold this for you for a little bit. No, I mean, it's very tricky. I always point to brands that do it well. And I point to the things that the brands that do it well do well. And then they can kind of look at that, and then look at theirs, and kind of like, look at that again, and like, whoa, what are we doing, you know?
So then how, two more
I think
things.
sometimes the problem is actually just the brand, and you have to address that. I mean, I was talking to Sunglass Hut, and they were asking me for some advice on how do we create buzz in our digital channels. And I started asking them some questions about the customers and the brand, their store experience, and it became clear that there was nothing to buzz about. So the brand, that they were just built the company around a very functional retail experience and just sort of having certain products. It was like the opposite of a Dr. J's. There was no cool, there was no style, there was no sense of like what is the Sunglass Hut about. And so I said, look, you're not going to create a cool digital campaign or a cool social brand until there's something cool about your brand. If you're a retail store, you're going to have to start with how can we create something that's interesting in our retail experience.
That you can then translate.
Yeah, get to the core of the brand that's something that's going to live there. And then you're going to have all kinds of ideas that can grow out of that. But until you have a brand strategy that's going to make your actual product, your actual customer experience itself interesting in some way, it's going to be very hard and sort of artificial to just hire some really smart copywriters to create this kind of clever, interesting social voice that just is sitting on top of a boring brand.
Right, so back to that thing of, you really need to be integral to the brand strategy rather than, let me get me one of those Facebook pages.
Well, to that point, actually, DJ Premium, the site that I manage, is the upscale sister site to Dr. J's, and they were just like, oh, Dr. J's Premium, DJ Premium, but the problem that I face every day is that people think we're a music site, not a fashion site. So, the brand identity itself is integral to all those things, and so we create content, we do behind the scenes videos with our photo shoots, and we do a lot of styling and focusing on showing people how to make outfits and, sort of wear the products, and that has been where our brand identity has emerged. But, you have to have a brand an experience that you can confirm or push forward through the communication.
And it has to be true to that, obviously. Terrific. Okay, well, we are going to open to questions. I know we started a little bit late, but so we'll take a few questions. We'll start back there. Right behind you, because he was getting my attention the entire time.
I'm completely undercut the rest of my audience members. But I want to address the question to Sveta and then everyone else on the panel. And my question, which I asked over Twitter as well, is for a brand, in what ways do you want a consumer to be active in co-creating your brand? A lot of the organizations that I work with, I tell them it's naive to think that you control your brand. You lost that somewhere around 2006, 2007. So how are you going to empower, and in what ways do you want your consumers to help co-create your brand, or your users, as might be the case with Sveta? What do you tell your clients in that instance?
It depends on the brand, honestly. So things like Pepsi, co-creation is core to the audience that brand is about. And so co-creation actually becomes almost a goal for us. It almost becomes an experience principle for us when we actually start to build. In co-creation always seems like the ultimate, because then you actually can learn so much about yourself as a brand, but also so much about the people that you're trying to reach. So that's always almost a strategic imperative. Not a strategic imperative. It's almost like a strategic goal for us. But how realistic in achieving that is always a bit of that's the healthy tension. So on financial services, it's kind of difficult to an extent to get people to want to co-create, but they can collaborate around what they are doing financial planning around. They're not necessarily going to fundamentally change a product. They can give us insights that we can then go and deliver a different product experience. But I think it's a bit of an iterative, unfortunately, approach that we need to take.
At best, it's iterative. I mean, even Pepsi Refresh, because I worked on that on the PI side of things, was planned to death. I mean, up front, and what appears from the consumer side to be like this amazing, yeah, like, oh no, whoa,
Brown swell.
yeah, it's like, no, that's AstroTurf, folks. That's a whole lot of AstroTurf. And the other thing is, I think great creative, which agencies still do, actually it can be amazingly transformative of a brand and can remake a brand in ways that a consumer will never. I mean, they're still wagging the dog, folks. I mean.
Yeah, there's this myth we kind of swung from one side to like, you are the absolute master of your brand, to like, you have no control, you must just be open to the winds of the customer. No, you are still the number one stakeholder in your brand. You have to take a leadership
You're hosting the
position.
party.
Yeah.
You're the host of the party. It's your house.
Yeah.
You have to make sure it doesn't get trashed. The gentleman right there, was that in front of the gentleman who just asked a question?
All right. Yvahn, you were talking before about Dr. J's and how you had somebody that had already co-opted the Twitter handle, and you tried to get it back, and apparently he was unresponsive. I think David used the example in his book of, I think it was Coca-Cola, was it, where somebody started that on their own, and then Coca-Cola, instead of pounding on them, actually sort of co-opted them, as part of the organization if they didn't outright hire them. Did you consider an approach like that, or you tried that and it didn't work, or what was the story there?
Did you guys in the back hear the question?
Can you repeat it?
Repeat it in your answer.
What we did, we reached out to that person, but he was actually a developer based in Dubai, and we could not afford to bring him into the fold per se. But we found a workaround. Our Twitter handle is drjs_com. The groups, we were able through Facebook to sort of get administrative access to that, and we do still have some fan administrators of the Facebook pages, and they were our most vocal participants to begin with, so they just continue that. But it's been an evolving process.
Thank you.
All the way in the back.
I actually have two questions, and they're sort of related. What do you do when your client's social media strategy and platform for their brand doesn't match their brick and mortar experience? And we talked about Best Buy, and I just read a horror story about how the in-store experience was just hellacious, and the employees didn't seem to know anything about their social media strategy. and it didn't match this whole like online cool social media strategy, and there was a big disconnect, and people were just writing hate on all the walls.
So,
And then the second part of the question would be, how do you rehabilitate a brand through social media? I'm thinking of the Komen debacle.
okay, so let's start with the first, which is how do you get your client to communicate, or to communicate with itself internally, which is a perennial issue, right? I mean, it is. It's a, you know, I have had clients say, hey, can you tell this other person in my firm that we're doing this thing? Couldn't you call?
I think what's interesting is that social media allows you to understand that your brick and mortar isn't actually delivering on the experience that the brand actually wants to deliver. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing. You actually have more visibility. So how do you communicate that? Look, I've struggled with it for years with different clients, and even just on advertising campaigns and whatnot. But it is the responsibility of the person initiating whatever that is to be able to funnel that down. Now, I think in the example of Best Buy, I think it's terrific. You have to do a much better job at customer service, and you can actually look to the learnings of 12 floors that really identify that when people buy a device, they really want advice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so you could actually use social media to retrain things that are happening in brick and mortar, but that disconnect is there.
That's the organizational issue.
Right, yeah, it's absolutely.
You can't just leave it in the domain of one part of the organization.
Right, back to what we were saying before, it's not the domain of marketing, and we don't ever talk to customer service person. And, and then actually we talked about rehabilitation. We didn't really talk much about rehabilitation of brands, and like the debacle with Komen or with Dove, not Dove, what was the chocolate brand, I forget, or Dove Bars, that had the whole social media horror show. How do you know, is there a way back? Is social media a medium that can be used for that, or is it something else?
I think that in the end, the answer to this user griping or community dissatisfaction or disapproval has to be earnest. And I think that when you start out from a place like, for example, the Best Buy situation, I think we've all had bad retail experiences and good retail experiences, and maybe that turns you off, from ever going back. But I think that once people see that actual action has taken to change that, that's when the claims become factual and hold credibility. So then people start to listen to you again. I think that you guys can probably speak to it more than I can, but all major brands, whether it's Pepsi or Koch or whatever the case might be, they have fad. What was it? The new flavor profile that didn't go over well. I don't drink sodas, so I don't know, but there was like whether it's packaging or people respond and say, hey, you know what, that really sucks. And if they're earnest about it, they'll change it.
To be earnest and honest.
And you got to be fast. I mean, the whole idea, it used to be, if you had a product that was unhealthy or dangerous or something catastrophic happened, you might have some blowback, and your PR department would get involved, and you have to manage it. But the whole idea of you're going to put out a new logo, and there's going to be an uproar, and you're going to have to change it.
Yeah.
You're going to tweak your packaging on your orange juice, and there's going to be a groundswell of protest, and you have to be ready to flip it back.
Right.
It's a different game.
Yeah.
To that question, I think what social allows you to do is react very quickly and to be transparent and potentially even apologize. And if you have a community there, they were there for a reason. People don't join communities to bash brands. I mean, we have to remember that. Some people do. Or there's a reason why they're there in the first place. So it's almost about using the community to benefit the perspective that you have and almost pushing your message out there. I worked on Motrin. There was a huge Motrin scandal. It was a really, really bad piece of content that went out there that really offended a lot of moms. I actually left by that, and I almost got fired over it, but that's a very long story. I really wanted it. I did agree with that piece of content going up, but you know what? There was no way to come back from it other than to just apologize and say I'm sorry. And you know what? We weren't human, and that's what we were supposed to do. And you know what? Motrin's doing phenomenally well, and it helped that Tylenol got recalled like a week later. But listen, there is that.
They had nothing to do with it.
I think being human is the key to all of it, honestly, because
Remember
your brand is you're in a stream with these people's friends and their parents and
That's
everybody,
interesting.
and you know, they want to engage with you in the same way that they're engaging with everybody else that's on these. And if your voice is authentic and human, then you can really push through. Whereas if it's authoritative or, you know, ad speak or marketing speak, it's going to be much harder to really make your case.
I mean, my friend Frank Eliason, who was kind of a pioneer at Comcast and then went over to Citi, you know, he was kind of, you know, a real pioneer of that approach. Look, he had a brand with horrible customer service reputation, with funny videos about a Comcast repairman and what a terrible job they did. And he just said, look, let me get on Twitter and try to do some customer service with this. Exactly, he would say, I'm sorry, anything, no matter how flippant or snide the comment was, would get a genuine response. He'd say, can I help you? You know, what's the issue? Let me see if I can get somebody to talk to you. He'd never, you know, take any offense at people's tone. And it just like he wore people down with his kindness. People finally started saying, maybe they're just not so bad after.
And for a while, before Frank left, Comcast Cares on Twitter was a better place to go than calling Comcast.
Yeah.
I mean, I was,
Interesting.
and then 9 months after corporate took it over, it's back to where it was. But
I think we have time for, Jamie, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're going to take a couple more from the audience, but then I'd really like to go through some Twitter questions that are interesting too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we might want to respond to those.
Hi there, I'm a brand strategist planner, and I had some questions. So content came up a couple of times, and you know, how do you sort of manage your content strategy? Some question is, have any of you guys worked with like third party, like Percolate is a new one that helps you curate your content, and so I was wondering if you had any experience doing that. And also Clout. Clout is like this, it gives you a number of every social media influencer, how useful are they, and if you had any sort of insight on
The new
Clout
Q
or
score.
something.
For the back of the room, the question is about content strategy and about who you use for content strategy and clout scores and how those are used.
So we are using Percolate on something right now. I'm trying to figure out if they can do a better job than potentially our content strategists. They can do a better job of making content pushed out a lot quicker on a global scale than potentially about people sitting in the rooms. But no, don't have a huge amount of, because they're new to the scene. In terms of defining a content strategy, we spent a lot of time doing that. It's not just the content, but it's not just the cadence, but the voice, and then actually the stuff that you see in it. And then how do we use Clout? It's a great social index to look at Twitter, but the benchmark is Bieber, right? And actually, I think someone just overtook him. So, you know.
Yeah, Whitney Houston.
Probably Whitney. Well, no, she, maybe the rankings for it. But we actually didn't talk about influence at all in the social space, but influence really matters, and so we do look at Clout. Now, if Clout were a broader platform that actually looked at how influence works in the social space, I think it would be a more powerful tool, certainly for me as a strategist.
Cool. Okay. You know what? We're going to take how many quick? One more
We
question.
have time for one more.
You can ask a question.
Me?
You can ask a question now.
So I'm the director of brand strategy for Bullmore Lanes. I'm sure, you know, when I say Bullmore Lanes, everyone's like, oh, I've been there for a company party. And so I'll tweet out or like, you know, send a message, you know, who's having their company party here? And no one will respond. And I'll put up a Rihanna video and literally I'll have 40 likes. So is it a right move to change my brand voice and to cater to the people who are actually interacting? If I say go Knicks or Lynn Sandy versus keeping with the brand identity we have on at the brick and mortar store or on our website?
I think asking questions is like that's like.
It's the guy at the bar.
Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, like the default, your thing becomes your
Trash the poor girl.
Yeah, like trash. I mean, no offense. But like, you know, if you didn't do anything, it would just be customer service. And then if you just like show up and put your hands on the keyboard, you're asking questions. I think you have to think about like what type of consumer you want to engage with, and like really like questions are great, but they have to be the right questions. Is what I should say.
Well, and I think you hit on it
Yeah.
in your example. The first example was just a question. What reason do I have to respond? The second example is content. Content always wins. So think about your brand, of course, as the person that we just identified, and how can you share that content as the person that is your brand? You don't necessarily have to post things that are outside of your scope of understanding, but how would your brand approach that Rihanna video? How would you as a person approach that Rihanna video and share it that way?
I mean, I would take one step further and say that content mixed with a question is the right way to go.
That's right.
Because then you get.
What do you think about Liz saying?
That's exactly.
What's he gonna do next?
Yeah, because then you're providing something useful to the person. They're getting some piece of knowledge, whatever it is. I mean, or entertainment, and then you're engaging them. And then if they answer your question, then you're, moving through their social network as well.
Not to be too, I think these are all tactics, right?
Mhm.
Do content, ask a question and whatnot. The question I'd ask is, what's your role with social media, and are you using your social channel to actually drive walk-ins through your door? Are you using social to actually, do you want, what is it for? Is it an acquisition tool, or is it about, look at all the great stuff that happened last night here? And then that could lead down to content creation. So kind of look at what you're trying to achieve with it, and what's the interaction you want to.
And that's where everything should start, always. I mean, absolutely. Twitter questions.
Twitter questions. So we're gonna have time for 2, I think.
Okay.
But I'm gonna ask. Eleanor asks, Nathaniel, this is for you specifically. Where do you get your content from Food Republic, and how are your top 5s legitimized?
All right. Well. We are a publishing company, so we actually have a very strong editorial director who's built out a team of editors that write for us. So we're a startup. We're at a very small scale, but we run a real newsroom, even though it's only 4 people. And then we have a team of freelancers around the country and around the world, actually, that also write for us. And we take our editorial very seriously because that's the core of what our brand is. Our top 5s are legitimized by the person that's writing them, whose voice we trust. Everybody can always argue with a top 5 list. If I tell you my 5 favorite bars, somebody else can have another 5 favorite bars, but they're all places that actually exist. We do our due diligence when we interview people, we fact check it, etc. And that's part of the expertise that we bring to brands when we're selling partnerships and social as well, is that we have excellent content that can work for any number of different brands or voices because we've created the team of writers that can empower them.
Great. And then one more from John to all of you guys. Do you recommend a good listening or analytics platform? He's saying Radiant 6 seems okay. It takes an army of interns to get sentiment analysis.
Does anybody have a favorite? Do you have a favorite? I mean, I do so many different ones.
I'm liking Sysomos right now. I think it's just a little bit more robust. But I also like, and it's just not available everywhere because it's so bloody expensive, is Microsoft Looking Glass. And I think what it does is it really connects the social sort of fabric within an organization, and I like to see what those results are. So some things we use, like with Lufthansa, we use Radiant 6, some things we use Sysomos, but these things move so quickly that we're just trying to stay ahead of it all the time.
What's interesting though is, deeper in that question is, okay, so you figured out how to get the client to do this thing and become part of the business model, and it's not, we got social got a seat at the table, and it's great. Now the avalanche of data comes, and that's when, and I've heard it, we've all heard it. The client says, oh, crap, I do not have an army of interns to deal with this. Stop it, shut it off. I can't deal with it. How does one manage through that? How do you help your client manage through the fact that there is a mountain of data, and that data needs to be curated, analyzed, all that kind of stuff?
I mean, my thing is, why do it if you're not going to learn from it?
Yeah.
And why do it if you're not going to measure the impact of it? So if you know what you're looking for, then it doesn't feel like a mountain of data. It feels like streams of data.
That's the thing, knowing what you're looking for. The crisis in data is because we have all this data and a lot of it is invaluable. I mean, unvaluable.
And some of it's invaluable.
And some of it's invaluable. And again, once you know what you're trying to do, or what you're trying to learn, or what decision you're trying to make, if you think of this decision-driven organization based on data, then the data is not so overwhelming anymore, because you're like, oh, actually, this is the question I need to ask the data.
Okay. We have...
Anybody else?
Okay, we have time for 2 more.
We just need to be a little
Lightning
time
round
conscious.
Lightning round questions.
Here and then here. Okay.
The one thing I'd love to hear just very quickly about something is as a former CMO at a firm, what I cared about was how am I going to monetize this? Because that's what I had to sell. I had to go into budget discussions, and one of the best discussions I ever had was with the CFO, who thought it was just going to be a great hard ass to kick the new marketing person around and say, your budget's way too high for PR. And I said, okay, great. You tell me how many times you want our CEO quoted in the Wall Street Journal, and I'll tell you what my budget should be. And there's like, well, but there was a correlation. You cut my ad budget, he's not going to see himself when he reads business. Okay, just it's that simple. Okay, and that isn't monetizing, but it's knowing what matters. And the CEO wanted to be in the paper, so therefore I could get my budget. How do I do it?
Exactly. That was the KPI.
What about all the social stuff? Are we driving people to?
I don't think your KPI should be social. I think your KPI should be the same one you already had.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to do a lot more diligent work. This is actually what I'm writing about right now for my next book. Is how do you? It's not the same, Nielsen giant metric model we've all built up over several years. We're all going to have to be a lot more agile and nimble, developing these models for whatever we're doing, depending on your objective. But you got to get to the same KPI you had before at the end of the day. It's got to be whether that's the CEO is quoted in Business Week, or if it's net promoter scores established within your organization, or you've got a universal brand metric, okay? But you got to get your tweets or these measures that some platform is giving you, and they're apples or oranges. You got to figure out some way to get that to how is that moving the trigger? How is that moving the needle? On something your business already cares about.
We know when we had to do work with Smirnoff, we look at all we look at the commercial value of building a community online. So I can actually tell you what the cost per fan is in terms of volume for cases sold. So we actually had to do the work, and that's how we sold in. And I'll be honest, when they said 10 million fans, I was like, oh fuck, how am I gonna get 10 million fans? And then I realized that actually yielded, I'm not gonna tell you what it is, but they're specific case volume. So then we realized that a portion of the content had to be very conversion driven, that there had to be levels of incentives within it. So it came back to the overall commercial KPI, which is around X volume sold.
Just how you get there.
And then how you get there changes, exactly.
Okay.
Oh, I said, sorry.
Twice.
Sorry.
Your options never run that one.
I'm actually moving over from insights analytics to social analytics right now, and I know that this conversation has been very Facebook, Twitter, quantifying what a fan is and that sort of thing, but I'm sort of interested more in the conversation of digital space and the presence and quantifying the presence of a brand, because things that are most shareable don't typically commence on Facebook. They end up on Facebook, like breading, like all these memes that are so much more popular than just a brand is, commence in sort of like the other community, like 4chan, or these spaces that brands don't want to touch but need to be somehow a part of the whole digital stream. And I was wondering if you guys have ever delved into that. How would you sell that to a client?
In terms of, I don't think I could let any of my clients go near 4chan. Getting the strategist on my team.
Right.
I just send them to chat roulette.
You're asking how to create authentic viral content, memes,
or how to be aware of what's.
So you're asking how you control the conversation that's happening before the conversation gets to Facebook.
Right, you guys were just, you were saying, the icing, what's the next thing after that, and how can our content be that? So I know it's not. I'm not saying let's go to 4chan and make fake news, or the start of that. But what I'm trying to I'm interested in sort of navigating the space that pervades all internet, not just Facebook and Twitter, which is really important.
But to what you guys all were saying before, and I'll just throw it out and then you guys talk, is that you have to remain true to your KPIs, to your corporate KPIs, remain true to what you're trying to accomplish, and then, so it's not as tactical as getting a chat roulette or getting on 4chan, but what are you trying to accomplish, and then how are you going to influence change based on that?
I mean, it sounds to me like what you're trying to be is cool. And which, for a certain brand, may be really important.
Maybe what needs that.
So it may be simply, I mean, if it's really imperative to the brand and the business is tied so much to that brand, is that it always is kind of countercultural and ahead of the curve and so forth. Same thing, you had to have your brand, your planners and your key branding people all along. They've got to be out there in the trenches, whatever that is, going to the parties, or maybe they are hanging out, unfortunately, or whatever. You know, figuring out kind of what's the next thing. But I don't think most brands and most organizations have like the strategy that they need.
They need to be aware.
Wait till it gets hot and then hop on. Everybody has to be able to do that. How to jump on, you know, whatever's happened. It's Whitney Houston, it's the Grammys, and it's the thing of the day, and it's and everybody's talking about something. And train yourself to say like, okay, how do I contribute to that conversation while it's still, you know, in everybody's mind in a way that has something to do with my brand that doesn't feel just like forced.
Shreeta disagrees. I've been waiting for this all night.
I think you're actually asking the question that we're asking a lot in the strategy team at Profera, which is we do this work, we find these trends, and we attach our brand to it, and then we assume that it's just going to blow up and amplify. And a lot of the times it does. But there's certain brands that we love that are out there. One of them I was saying that I wanted to talk to you about, and it happens to be a very unknown vodka brand. And I believe that how they are actually going to make it is by permeating digital culture and actually being down there with 4chan and actually creating digital artifacts that are going to get picked up by other brands. So I do believe that you have to have the right brand fit to do that. Converse is one of the best brands to go out there now that they ditched having to like compete with like making basketball shoes, and they got back to the Chuck Taylor and became about optimistic rebellion, right? That's a brand that actually knows what it's about, has a loyal following. So I believe that there's some brands out there that can actually be part of that conversation with 4chan, but not in a branded way. And that's what I don't know if I figured that out.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem in those areas of the internet, is that the people in 4chan or other sites like that, they have a really strong nose for anything that's coming from what they view as authority, which is a brand, it's a government, it's a celebrity, and it's a very fine line between, you know, seeding those communities with your message and getting one to blow up, and actually, you know, creating some damaging information that, you know, will then blow up.
Getting them to hack your server.
Exactly, something like that. Right. So it's you know, most brands want to stay where most of the people are, which is why we've been talking about Facebook and Twitter. But to your point, there are some brands that can get into the.
But it has to be true to the brand.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it fear like Santorum, like how the internet, if you are fake, the internet can rebel against you, and like Google Santorum.
That was created by Dan Savage.
It was on there because of the democracy.
I know, but he created that through print. Through his column. What you're talking about is culture, though.
Yeah.
And you're talking about how do you infect culture. I mean, I don't know, work for the CIA?
Yeah, it's a different
you know what I mean? Like, that's not my job. That's like wagging the dog at a different level.
Okay, so I'm shutting this puppy down. Because that is a separate. We're on to the next social media, the next conversation. So thank you for, on behalf of all of our panelists and myself, for joining us, and our lovely Janie would like to.
I wanted to just as well thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We hope that this was an informative and interesting topic for you guys. If you have any questions about the program, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'll be here after the event. And again, thank you so much for our panelists.